Chapter 7. Consensus in Cell R through the lens of demarcation. Demarcating L2 science from L2 pedagogy, the phenomenon is not its intervention.
A scientific consensus presupposes the presence of a science, and as it became apparent in the above discussion, this in turn requires some kind of criterion of demarcation. However, the demarcation criteria Collins and Evans 2007 provide, as mentioned in the previous chapter, also pushes us to go beyond common notions of demarcation, where science has only one clear opposite. And this opposite can only be pseudoscience. Instead, their criteria takes into account the very real need to respect and even protect decision-making, while categorically differentiating it from science. Boumans and Martini 2014 offer a similar and relevant distinction, which also divides science from its application, but under a different rationale. They state,
"Experts are different from politicians, insofar as their concern is, at least to a greater extent, with the truth of the matter, but also from the pure scientists, in that they focus on concrete problems and tasks."
p. 5. This statement introduces an important notion, which is the identification of two very different values, truth of the matter versus concrete problems and tasks. What I argue here is that SLA is a field where these two forces find themselves at odds in a systematic way, interfering with each other, and at times they are mistaken for each other or conflated. I will offer a representative example. Nearly 40 years ago, Horwitz et al. 1986 published their proposal for a specific kind of anxiety, the foreign language classroom anxiety. A Likert-type questionnaire consisting of 33 items was proposed as an instrument to measure it. The Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale, FLCAs. There was a now infamous historical misconstrual in the field, that Horwitz et al. Proposed a three-factor scale, that is, researchers around the world believed the 33 items were proposed to be grouped neatly into three subdimensions, that is, communication apprehension, test anxiety and fear of negative evaluation, because these were mentioned as examples of possible contributors to a foreign language anxiety in the original proposal. But in fact,
the 33 original FLCA's items came from a number of sources including the experiences of anxious language learners, and were not chosen to represent a three-factor model.
Horwitz, 2. I would argue this misinterpretation is very understandable, since usually psychometric questionnaires in SLA tend to employ a factorial approach to psychometrics, where the items can be divided and grouped into subdimensions, groups of related questions, and these are commonly validated through factor analysis, checking that the questions can be grouped through their statistical relationships. Because most researchers expect this from a scale, naturally, a number of researchers throughout the years attempted to scrutinize the FLCAs, leading them to observe that questions did not neatly group into three subdimensions. In response to this situation, one of the many arguments Horwitz 2017 put forward is as follows.
An overemphasis on clarifying the components of language anxiety may actually keep the language teaching profession from taking the already understood straightforward steps to help anxious language learners. Although psychologists and therapists encounter individuals experiencing a wide array of anxieties, they typically choose from a small list of anxiety reduction approaches, including support, desensitization, and cognitive therapy. Since language teachers are not mental health professionals, individual support within the context of a positive classroom environment would seem to be our best approaches for helping our anxious students.
p. 38. On the one hand, of course, as a teacher I could not agree more with Horwitz that scrutinizing the scale statistically, that is, figuring out whether groups of questions fit clearly and neatly into a certain number of subdimensions, does not seem to offer any real solution to the problem of anxiety in classrooms, especially if the questionnaire was not designed to go through those analyses. I would even add that some contemporary philosophers of science question whether construct validation through factor analysis is itself valid in the first place. Alexandrova and Hebron, 2016. Having said that, I also cannot help but to identify that the intention of such statistical scrutiny is not merely pedagogical, but also ontological and methodological. Horwitz knows this, of course, and she even calls for a more balanced research agenda, where helping anxious learners is her main priority, but where she still sees the benefit in research that tries to advance our basic understanding of language anxiety. p. 42. But where would that balance be? Is there really a balance if the only reason we research language anxiety is to apply that knowledge in classrooms? The risk I see here is that in focusing on concrete problems and tasks, that is how to support anxious L2 instructed learners, we risk shunning the truth of the matter away. And there are many questions about the truth of L2 anxiety we do not seem to be asking. Does language learning anxiety actually exist? If so, what is it? Is it a behavior, a physiological response to stress, a cultural symbol being subconsciously performed for an audience, a mental state trait, or a culturally bound perception by the researcher? Is it a complex combination of all of the above? Then how could a questionnaire be sophisticated enough to capture that? Why would another questionnaire be any better or worse? Through what kind of ontology could that be determined outside of statistical correlationism? Why would interviews be any better if the researcher's perception is culturally bound? To argue these questions merit less attention than actual pedagogical solutions for students would be to conflate the study of second language acquisition with the study of second language education, or in more fundamental terms, to employ a philosophy of education in response to matters which are dependent on a philosophy of science. What I think I have identified is that Horwitz and many researchers show signs of understanding science as being morally determined by application, and application as perfectly synonymous with pedagogical interventions.
In order to move forward, I believe that identifying unique profiles of individuals and members of different cultural and other demographic groups would make important contributions to understanding and alleviating language anxiety.
P43 emphasis added. The framing is subtle, but it is there. To alleviate language anxiety is to help students. Helping students is a good value to hold, but not all. Multilinguals are also L2 students, and pedagogy is not the only social problem to solve through an L2 science. The balance between seeking scientific truths and solving social problems is indeed subjective, value-driven, and in need of much philosophical inquiry. Whether L2 anxiety plays a role in L2 acquisition is dependent on whether L2 anxiety exists, and worries over negative emotions affecting acquisition in classrooms have to contend with basic facts outside of privileged educational context. For example, the fact that some immigrants in situations of stress, exploitation, discrimination, and generally against all odds successfully learn their second languages. As Gebhard 1999 pointed out,
individual characteristics of learners are not descriptors of their internal mental state in any static or politically neutral way.
P5. Arguing these cases of successful learning against all odds are statistically rare would also not be good enough, because a true science needs to explain why these cases are possible in the first place. That is through which mechanisms, and it is only after this, that we can then establish how relevant the statistics could really be, and what kind of measurements and observations are valid or really possible. In order to disentangle truth seeking from problem solving, we need a clear division between science and scientifically informed practice. To put it in very definite terms, instructed second language acquisition can never be the study of human second language acquisition. To begin with, L2 acquisition and multilingualism are phenomena that predate most of the conditions we can find in classrooms. Not only that, it predates formal education, the field of linguistics, national languages, and even writing systems. Who knows? Taking into account Michael Tomasello's research with chimps and children, which led him to the hypothesis that pointing and pantomiming, essentially sign language, may be the one step before the emergence of meaning-bearing vocalizations, see Tomasello 2021, could potentially suggest to us that the ability to communicate in more than one symbolic system may predate spoken language, and even Homo sapiens. Whatever the case, the important thing to keep in mind is the fact that all these things that came after the socio-cognitive infrastructure that allows us to communicate in more than one symbolic system as a species can only be the conditions or mediating factors that enable, supercharge, shape, or inhibit such phenomenon, but not the fundamental skeleton, the real origin that allows for everything else to take place. But of course, L2 development in learners' language taps into complex neurological systems that give rise to fundamentally social cognition, powerful enough to create entire cultures and civilizations, so it would be strange to stop theory building at the skeleton and ignore the unfathomable symbolic universes that have been enabled by it. Symbols range from the Code of Hammurabi to contemporary cultural memes like the expression, "Okay, boomer," and everything in between, including all stories, all of science and all knowledge, as long as that knowledge can be put into words. Language cannot be so neatly separated from cognition, cognition from social cognition, and social cognition from our lived experiences in a context of change, be it fast or slow change. New situations, new language. As discussed in Chapter 3, language changes, so something in the socio-cognitive infrastructure allows for change and adaptability. And language is also stable, so something in the socio-cognitive infrastructure gives rise to stability and normativity. Stable, yet being constantly changed to adapt. A11. Structure that restructures each language and each specific dialect in a way, tell one version of the history of humanity. What happens then when two languages, two histories of humanity meet? Our broad theoretical landscape tells us that what we are looking at in L2 acquisition, in the making of a multilingual, is a robust process with many components: cultural, symbolic, informational, cognitive, neurological and biological, innate and non-innate, individual, social, interactional, and environmental. This robust nature may give the process the ability to occur even if important components are taken away, akin to how blind people learn their first language, in spite of the key component of vision not being part of the developmental process. The implication is that there is a big risk in mainly theorizing from instructed learners, as we need to more seriously reflect whether the way we teach them is through depriving them from some, if not most, of the basic socio-cognitive infrastructure that supports the development of an L2. By way of analogy, we could say that people can see with one eye and walk on one foot, but these conditions are not representative of the natural human experience, or of the anatomical specialization of the body. Thus, de facto focusing on L2 instruction while by name investigating L2 acquisition development is to confuse the naturally occurring phenomenon with its potentially incomplete artificial and idiosyncratic intervention. That means intervening in something expecting good results, while not knowing what that something is and thus what good results look like. I should clarify that in providing such a criticism, I am not subscribing to narratives that highlight a presupposed natural innate primacy of input. While they minimize the role of attention to form during socially situated outputs and interactions, because both this view and the other more traditional one that revolves exclusively around focus on form and explicit only means of learning have the same problem of focusing too much on a single aspect and presuppose it as central. People learning languages because of a given reason has to contend with the alternative explanations, for example, that people learn languages in spite of that same reason, or that the linguistic outcomes of learners who are deprived from different components of the infrastructure appear to be broadly the same, also known as equiphonal, but they are not, an issue that depends on fine measurement, which in turn is impossible without a unified theory of language proficiency. In order to agree on fundamentals and ultimate questions to then give shape to a valid scientific paradigm, we ought to work on identifying what the ontological foundations of multilingualism and second language acquisition are, and not disattend such matters, because they are not perceived as useful for classrooms. Because ultimately, if the mission in the field is to get at better pedagogies, then SLA and SLD are misnomers, as what is being studied is the intervention, rather than the phenomenon, while second language pedagogy seems to be a more appropriate name for a field of inquiry with such a goal. In other words, deep investigation, the source of which is curiosity, and the scope of which is humanity, clashes with applied investigation, the scope of which is a very selective choice of particular problems only relevant to particular groups of people, and the source of which is those groups' perceived needs, their interests and their values.
L2 acquisition is not a problem to be solved, the case for intentional pluralism.
The pedagogy bias has many implications, one of which is the systematic exclusion of diverse communities and types of multilinguals. When we focus on types of tasks, grammar versus input, input versus interaction, how learner internal individual differences, such as motivation and anxiety, influence learning. Among other topics which seem to have been born in the conceptual context of instructed learning, we set up a field that always pushes us to lose the perspective that people have always learned, and continue to successfully learn their L2S throughout history, assisted by grammar translation approaches, audiolingual classrooms, communicative language teaching, by being completely alone in their bedrooms but deeply connected to the world via internet, by renouncing formal study and always being out talking to people, in privileged situations, in the worst possible human conditions, with the interest and intention to learn a language, with indifference to the language but deep engagement in an activity that requires it, and forced to learn by sheer necessity. I'm sure researchers know this. For every dogmatic idea as to what the best way to learn a language is, we will be able to find a case study to contradict it. And we are highly proficient at dismissing particular cases that contradict our beliefs, which we label as outliers or exceptional people. But in which of the above-mentioned list of contexts does successful learning represent the presence of an outlier? And once we have outliers, how do we scientifically explain them? More importantly, how much could outliers challenge our skewed theories and our biased samples of so-called weird participants? Why are outliers possible? And what could this possibility teach us about the process of L2 acquisition development? How can we take these cases seriously in a context of statistical supremacy, where what is probable is viewed as more important than what is possible? How can qualitative data be reconciled with correlationist and probabilistic statistical models? Finally, could it be that none of them are outliers and the real problem is that we simply do not understand L2 acquisition development yet? To address these challenging questions, we need to build a consensus that rests on not only a non-applied curiosity-based comprehensive science, but also on intentional pluralism. That is, we need to intentionally focus on and bring to the field more voices, stories and perspectives from around the world and inquire into historical cases for the very important function of challenging the way we understand multilingualism and L2 acquisition development. Because a culturally skewed consensus is neither an ethical one, nor an epistemically strong one. Often SLA problems are framed in terms of why an individual in the process of learning a second language is, or is not, successful in becoming fluent or proficient. But the conceptual line between learning and studying is often blurry in SLA, For example, Gass et al. 2020 begin their introduction to the field with,
How do people learn a second, or a third, or a fourth language? The simple answer is, with great difficulty.
P3, although these authors very quickly establish their posture, which is that SLA is not about pedagogy. P4, the literature they go on to review in their almost 700-page monograph does not exactly reflect this idea. Navigating this division, SLA versus pedagogy, is a tricky endeavor as we have seen above, because the bias is not always so easily elucidated. The pedagogy bias goes beyond opinions as to the intention and scope of the field, being deeply materialized into methodologies and bodies of knowledge which observe a highly skewed sample of humans and establishes patterns and principles through statistical correlationism and probabilism, all of which taken together leads to narratives that creep into scientific discourse in extremely subtle ways. Case in point, Gass et al. 2020. In mentioning difficulty in their very first statement, already inadvertently portray L2 acquisition as a sort of problem. My living in Taiwan made this subtle framing particularly salient. L1 Mandarin-speaking children here will often learn Taiwanese Hokkien from their grandparents, while they will learn English at school. Experience tells me that narratives of difficulty will focus on the study of English, while low proficiency of Taiwanese Hokkien is rarely framed this way, as this is an oral, mostly uninstructed language people grow up with, where proficiency depends largely on closeness to older relatives and low proficiency is not seen as a problem, since young people do not seem interested in communicating with each other through this language anymore, due to the sociological phenomenon of language shift. Through teaching at a private language center, however, I have been also exposed to one more subpopulation of learners in Taiwan. Students in super elite international schools who somehow have the reverse condition. English is their dominant, everyday, effortless language, while they only use Mandarin with their families and certain friends. So, the framing of L2 learning as difficult is a very common one, but a look at the true diversity of multilinguals, even within one single city, hints at how this framing is representative of very selective sets of conditions and assumptions. I believe Krashen's influential hypotheses can also be viewed as largely resembling this framing of L2 acquisition, development as a problem of difficulty that needs to be solved, input solves the grammar problem. I will expand on this last claim and some of its potential implications. Lickman and Van Patten 2021 remind us that Krashen's hypothesis in a way led to many of today's lines of research. Indeed, once drawn one can see such connections easily. The distinction between acquisition and learning led to contemporary research on explicit and implicit learning. The affective filter hypothesis can be seen as leading to research on individual differences such as L2 motivation and L2 anxiety and so forth. But inherent in all these lines of research is the framing of second language acquisition as a sort of problem to be solved. If we use this particular lens to review the field's history, we could say that language transfer studies and their core concern, that is, our students do not seem to learn the rules we teach. The problem must be the first language, evolved to cognitive views that treated language as a problem of obtaining the right kind of information. That is, the problem is teaching grammar instead of access to input, which clashed with alternative traditions such as skill building, that is, input is not the panacea, learners need various types of practice, and other approaches like SCT and CDST that try to take many factors as possible into account, that is, certain contexts and certain factors affect certain learners in certain ways. We should see which specific affordances give rise to which specific outcomes. It may be, as Larson Freeman 2018 points out, that some of these approaches are more reductionist, focusing on a basic process of acquisition, while others are more holist, focusing instead on differential development, p59. However, regardless of this distinction, we can see in all of them a quest for a formula to understand and enhance L2 teaching, which is commonly narrativized as ineffective, and where learning is a difficult process, that is a problem to be solved. What I argue is that L2 acquisition is only a problem to be solved when we take a naturally occurring socio-cognitive phenomenon that self-evidently takes thousands of hours of complex cognition embedded in the grand scheme of our multifaceted lives, and try to artificially cram it into a classroom setting, limited to a few dozen hours of instruction per semester, with varying amounts of students who were not really given a choice to be there, and where not a great deal of meaningful experiences can really take place, all the while we for some reason insist on expecting the same results, if not better ones. See Gebhard, 1999 for a comparable discussion. Because we see cases of successful L2 learning, we are emboldened to try to force this success onto every single individual who is exposed to the right kind of pedagogy. And when they ultimately do not reach our toxically ambitious expectations, we try to pinpoint the reasons on what are assumed to be objective and value-free variables, aptitude, anxiety, motivation, etc. While having unmotivated students may sound like an opportunity to create more motivating classroom environments, I fear this position is naive of the very real political influences, which all around the world mediate the somewhat aggressive anglicization of both children and labor forces. The pedagogy bias skews the study of individual differences towards a view that 1. Is blind to historical and political processes around the world, and 2. Is not trying to explain the process of human L2 acquisition development, but rather successful outcomes within educational contexts. Many policies at various levels effectively force students to learn languages, creating a mysterious variable, which is unique to contemporary educational contexts, and which is rarely addressed or deeply reflected upon in the discussion sections of studies, whether they were given the choice to be there. This notion may be unfamiliar to some researchers who themselves are L1 English speakers, and whose participants are university students who choose willingly to learn a language. But for the rest of us the notion is more familiar, and by the rest of us I mean people who as kindergartners were made to recite numbers and colors in a strange foreign language, for what seemed no apparent reason, only to have this language later determine our academic and career prospects as we grew up. Motivation theories are supposed to take that into consideration, through concepts like extrinsic motivation. But can these theories capture the effects that world issues and linguistic policies have on second language students? Some national policies even require university students to take English courses, which means even adults are institutionally forced to learn this language regardless of their will, and regardless of whether they have already become proficient in any L2 other than English. Other policies, either governmental or regulated by a university or an academic program of some sort, do not require English specifically, but they do require a second or even a third language. Usually the choice is limited to a few prestigious languages, of course. I believe that in the context of these policies we should ask ourselves, are de facto forced students representative of L2 acquisition development? Are de facto forced students representative of most multilinguals? Are studies that examine participants in compulsory English courses politically neutral? And if not, what does that do to validity? It seems that in our quest to be scientific, technical and objective, we have created highly selective ways to study acquisition development, leading to something we could call savant theories. Theories which are highly specialized, sophisticated in their terminology and methodologies, but blind to their own inappropriate political and geographical biases, which are hidden by the common belief that science is value-free. As we saw above, the making of a multilingual entails not only the building of an internal grammar, or the proceduralization of linguistic knowledge, but the clash of cultural symbols, values, and histories in a politically charged process. Yet theories, pedagogies and research designs in SLA often seem to assume we can de-axiologize, de-historicize, and de-politicize language teaching and learning to focus on what are presumed to be objective psychological measures. But are those measures really valid, when they are ignorant of other levels of analysis? A delicate distinction may be needed here. Why certain humans do not become proficient is a scientific puzzle for sure. As such it belongs to the realm of science, but a fallaciously similar, yet fundamentally different matter, is how we ensure better educational outcomes through better teaching for the benefit of students, including forced students. This is a problem to be solved, and as such it does not belong to the realm of science, but to the realm of scientifically informed decision-making. We run again into the conflation of truths of the matter, and concrete problems and tasks. This line between a mystery and a problem seems to be very tricky in Cell A. But in fact, as I have been arguing, such difference may be a key criterion of demarcation for our field. Thus, I believe we need potent clarity. In this point, people have always learned additional languages without our help. Sometimes we lose this perspective, as captured in a witty remark by Soares and Soares 1993, who, in the context of academic discourse that elevated the status of communicative language teaching over other teaching methods, wrote,
"There is almost an assumption that nobody learned a language successfully before the arrival of the communicative approach."
p. 3. It is also true that this process has limits, with a certain success rate, but while we can intervene to increase the success rate, framing it as a problem is more of a value judgment than a scientific observation. In other words, whether we can intervene is a scientific question, but whether we should intervene is a political question. In short, L2 acquisition is not a problem to be solved, it is a naturally occurring phenomenon, the understanding of which can aid diverse problems in the world, including, but not limited to helping students learn additional languages if so they wish. To have an epistemically robust and equitable science, we would need to observe the phenomenon in all of its manifestations, and this requires a psychological change on our part, fundamentally questioning our theories and methodologies through intentional pluralism, actively looking for grounding and sobering perspectives, preferably from a range of diverse voices with diverse experiences across geographies and even time periods. Voices that have been studied but not to the extent that they can shape major theories, voices which cannot be properly heard or put at the center of the conversation in the context of a pedagogy bias, self-learners, polyglots, privileged and unprivileged children who move countries at different ages, heritage speakers of all kinds, people from multilingual societies, speakers of languages which are in the middle of language shift or on the verge of language death, cultures reviving their already dead languages, first and second generation speakers of pidgins, creoles, and even artificially created languages like Esperanto, not to mention combinations of all of the above which may not be mutually exclusive categories. Routes to multilingualism cannot be neatly divided into child and adult, first and second, strictly naturalistic or strictly instructed. These unimaginative dichotomous categories seem to also stem from the pedagogy bias. In a word, fixating on instructed learners entails the risk of not only hyper-focusing on a particular type of multilinguals, but also the risk of an idealization that our pedagogies are, or should be, strong enough to determine outcomes, where determining an outcome is conflated with solving a problem, which in turn is wrongly equated with scientifically explaining L2 acquisition. How we explain the complex phenomena of multilingualism and L2 acquisition, development which encompasses a great diversity of populations, I submit, is independent from the study of classrooms.